The cafe was alive with the usual morning hustle, a symphony of clinking cups, murmured conversations, and the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. Nestled in the heart of Ravenhurst City, Lucio's Cafe was the kind of place where people sought a momentary escape from the chaos outside. Among the crowd stood a woman, her black leather jacket slightly scuffed, her posture relaxed yet vigilant. Her name was Leora Moreau, though to the cafe patrons she was just another customer waiting her turn. No one would have guessed that she was one of the FBI's top criminal investigation agents, currently deep undercover. For weeks, she had been piecing together the fragments of a conspiracy involving police corruption, disappearances, and a dangerous trafficking ring. Today, she wasn't here for coffee, she was here to confirm a hunch. Across the street, a man loitered near a lamppost. His jacket was too bulky for the warm morning, his hands darting nervously into his pockets. Leora had seen his type before. A courier, someone carrying information or goods for people who didn't want to be seen. She didn't stare, didn't give any sign that she noticed him, but her mind cataloged every detail, his uneven gait, the way his left hand trembled, the sweat gathering at his temple. Then the cafe door swung open with a force that made the bell above it rattle, and in walked Officer Bryce Calloway. Calloway was a man who carried his authority like a weapon, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room, as if searching for someone to challenge him. His reputation was as infamous as his presence, years of complaints for excessive force, racial profiling, and brutality, all buried under layers of protection afforded by his rank and connections. Today he looked as smug as ever, his uniform pristine, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He moved through the room like a king surveying his domain, brushing past patrons without apology. When his gaze landed on Leora, something about her calm composure seemed to irritate him. "Out of my way," he barked, shoving past her to reach the counter. Leora stepped aside, her expression unchanged. "I believe I was here first," she said, her voice measured and cool. Calloway froze, his head turning toward her as if her words were an affront. "What did you just say to me?" "You heard me," Leora replied, her tone devoid of emotion. For a moment the cafe grew quiet. All eyes were on the officer and the woman who had dared to stand her ground. Calloway's lip curled in disdain. "You people think you can just talk however you want. Maybe you need a lesson in respect." He grabbed the steaming cup of coffee that had just been placed on the counter and, without warning, hurled it at her. The liquid splashed across Leora's jacket, droplets scattering onto the floor. Gasps rippled through the room, but while others might have flinched or yelled, Leora didn't move. She stood still, her expression unchanged, her eyes fixed on Calloway. "You'll regret this," she said softly, her words cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. Calloway sneered. "Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" His laughter was loud, mocking as he turned and strode out of the cafe. Leora watched him go, her gaze unreadable. Inside, her mind was already at work. The man she had been trailing for weeks had just given her exactly what she needed: confirmation. Calloway wasn't just another bad cop, he was deeply involved in the network she was investigating. The moment transits from the quiet tension of the cafe to the darkness of a surveillance room. Leora sat at a desk, her leather jacket replaced by a crisp black suit. The glow of monitors illuminated her face as she scanned a series of files, each one marked with warnings and redacted lines. Calloway's name appeared again and again, tied to missing persons reports, falsified arrests, and mysterious payments. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She answered it without taking her eyes off the screen. "It's me," she said. "Calloway's involved. He's the connection I've been looking for." The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. And the next step. "There's a shipment tonight," Leora said. "An informant mentioned a warehouse on 8th. I'm heading there." The moment transits again to a shadowed alley where a man, the same one from outside the cafe, paced nervously. His eyes darted between the dimly lit street and the phone in his hand. He didn't notice the figure approaching from the shadows until it was too late. Leora grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the brick wall, her movements swift and precise. "Who are you working for?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. The man stammered, his hands shaking. I don't know what you're talking about." Leora tightened her grip. "Don't lie to me." Before he could respond, a sharp noise echoed from the far end of the alley. Footsteps. Leora turned just in time to see 3 men emerging from the darkness, their faces masked, their weapons drawn. What followed was chaos. The men lunged at her, knives flashing under the dim streetlights. Leora moved like water, her body twisting and dodging with practiced precision. She disarmed one attacker with a swift kick, sending his blade clattering to the ground. The second came at her with a lead pipe, but she ducked, grabbed his arm, and twisted until he cried out in pain. The third man hesitated, but only for a moment. He drew a gun, aiming for her chest, but Leora was faster. She grabbed the lead pipe from the ground and hurled it, the metal striking his wrist with a sickening crack. As the men lay groaning on the ground, Leora stepped over them, her breath steady. She turned back to the informant, who was now cowering against the wall. "Talk," she ordered. Okay, he stammered. "The shipment, it's at the warehouse tonight. Calloway's part of it. That's all I know, I swear." Leora stared at him for a long moment before stepping back. "If you're lying, I'll find you." She disappeared into the shadows, her figure melting into the night. What exactly was being moved in that warehouse? And how far would Leora have to go to expose the truth? Before the story continues, pause for a moment, kindly hit the like and subscribe button. Every week we dive into stories of justice, betrayal, and redemption, where nothing is ever as it seems, and make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Now let's get back to the story. Leora Morrow, known to her colleagues as one of the most skilled criminal investigation agents in the FBI, wasn't always the composed, strategic woman she appeared to be now. Her journey to this moment had been forged in the fires of personal loss and unrelenting ambition. Born and raised in Rensfield, a small, industrial town riddled with corruption, Leora's childhood was marked by the absence of justice. Her father, a mechanic, had been falsely accused of theft by a local officer, his reputation shattered, and his livelihood destroyed. She had watched helplessly as the legal system turned a blind eye to the truth, leaving her family to scrape by on scraps. The bitter taste of injustice stayed with her, fueling her determination to ensure no one else endured what her family had. By the time she entered the FBI Academy, Leora had become known for her sharp instincts and relentless work ethic. She specialized in dismantling organized crime and rooting out corruption within law enforcement, a reputation that earned her the nickname the Shadow. She could blend into any situation, uncovering secrets without being detected. Now, years later, her current mission brought her to Ravenhurst City, where whispers of a trafficking ring tied to the local police precinct had drawn her attention. Reports of routine arrests, ending in untraceable detains, had grown too numerous to ignore, and the name that appeared in every shadowy thread of this operation was Officer Bryce Calloway. Calloway's rise to power had been anything but earned. The son of Captain Marcus Calloway, a former precinct chief, Bryce had spent his entire life shielded from the consequences of his actions. Every complaint, every accusation, every lawsuit against him was buried before it saw the light of day. This protection bred arrogance, and arrogance bred cruelty. Calloway's methods weren't just questionable, they were lethal. But Leora knew better than to believe that Calloway acted alone. His recklessness was a symptom of a much larger disease. The entire precinct reeked of conspiracy, from falsified arrest records to unexplained financial transactions. Someone higher up was pulling the strings, using Calloway as a pawn to further their own agenda. Leora's investigation had led her to a critical juncture. Over the past month, she had followed leads that pointed to the precinct's involvement in a trafficking ring, human lives being smuggled under the guise of law enforcement. The arrests were real, the charges fabricated, and the victims disappeared into a labyrinth of corruption. Calloway wasn't just a cog in the machine, he was the face of its cruelty. His history of racism and unchecked aggression made him the perfect front for those who sought to exploit the vulnerable. But if there was one thing Leora had learned in her years of chasing shadows, it was that no one was untouchable. Her mission wasn't just to take down Calloway, it was to burn the entire operation to the ground. And to do that, she needed more than just circumstantial evidence. She needed a direct link between Calloway and the trafficking ring, something irrefutable that would force even the most corrupt officials to act. The moment transits from Leora's quiet contemplation to the dimly lit office of Captain Marcus Calloway, Bryce's father and the former precinct chief. The room smelled of stale cigars and aged leather, the walls lined with plaques and commendations that now seemed more like trophies of deceit. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable as Bryce stood before him, recounting the incident at Lucio's cafe. "She didn't even flinch," Bryce said, his voice tinged with frustration. "She just stood there like she knew something I didn't." Marcus studied his son for a long moment, his steely gaze piercing. "You've been sloppy, Bryce. If this woman is who I think she is, you've just drawn her attention straight to us." Bryce frowned. "Who she is? She's just some nobody who thinks she's tough. What's the big deal?" Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "You've always been short-sighted. That nobody could be the reason we lose everything we've built." "Built?" Bryce sneered. "You mean everything you covered up for me? I'm the one taking all the risks out there?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "And I'm the one keeping your reckless ass out of prison. Do not make the mistake of thinking you're indispensable. If she's FBI, she won't stop until she tears this precinct apart. You'll handle this, Bryce, or I will." Bryce's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his pride momentarily giving way to the authority of his father. The moment transits to the darkened warehouse on 8th Street, where Leora crouched behind a stack of crates, her heart steady as she surveyed the scene before her. Men in uniforms moved about, loading unmarked boxes onto trucks under the pale glow of floodlights. She could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken understanding that whatever was in those crates was worth killing for. She adjusted her earpiece, whispering into the mic. "Team 1, in position. Confirm visual on target." A voice crackled back. "Confirmed. Calloway's on site, accompanied by 3 armed men." Leora's pulse quickened. This was at the moment she'd been waiting for. But as she prepared to move, the sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. She turned just in time to see a flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. What she hadn't anticipated was Calloway's habit of doubling back, checking his blind spots. He wasn't just a brute, he had moments of cunning, moments that made him dangerous. And now she was cornered, caught between the loaded trucks and the man she was hunting. What would Calloway do if he discovered her identity? And how far would Leora have to go to keep her cover intact while taking the first decisive step in dismantling the ring? Leora crouched in the shadows near the warehouse, her breath steady as she counted the seconds. She was too close to turn back now. Every step of her investigation had led her here, to this precarious moment where one wrong move could mean her cover, and possibly her life, would be blown. The tension of the moment was a familiar weight, one she had learned to carry years ago. The trail leading her here had been anything but smooth. It began with missing persons reports, too many to ignore, all with the same haunting pattern, individuals arrested for minor infractions and disappearing soon after. She had spent weeks combing through databases, compiling the names of victims who were last seen in the custody of officers from the same precinct. Officer Bryce Calloway's name appeared in nearly every case file, but he wasn't alone. The precinct itself was a labyrinth of secrets, and Leora knew she had to infiltrate it to find the hard evidence she needed. One night, under the cover of darkness, she slipped inside. Her movements were swift, practiced. Every sound, every shadow, was a potential threat. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors kept her on edge as she navigated the hallways. She reached the records room, her pulse quickening. The door was locked, but that was the least of her concerns. She pulled out a set of tools and worked quickly, the satisfying click of the lock disengaging after only a few seconds. She slipped inside, careful not to disturb anything that might give away her presence. The room was lined with filing cabinets, shelves, and a single computer terminal glowing faintly in the corner. Leora moved to the computer, plugging in a small drive to bypass the security system. Names and records flashed across the screen, files upon files of arrests that followed the same pattern she had uncovered. But then, something new caught her eye: financial records. Payments, large and untraceable, were linked to arrests conducted by Calloway and a handful of other officers. The amounts varied, but the pattern was clear. The arrests weren't random. These were targeted operations, and someone was profiting from them. Just as she began copying the files, the sound of voices in the hallway froze her. "You sure you locked it?" a gruff voice said. "Yeah, I locked it. Stop worrying. We'll do the sweep and be done," another replied. Leora's heart pounded as the footsteps grew louder. She shut off the monitor, yanked her drive free, and darted behind a tall shelf. The door opened, light spilling into the room as two officers entered. "Doesn't look like anyone's been here," one muttered. "Still, better check everything. You know how paranoid Calloway gets." The men began moving through the room, their flashlights sweeping over the cabinets and shelves. Leora pressed herself into the shadows, every muscle tensed, her breathing shallow. One of the flashlights passed dangerously close to her hiding spot before moving on. After what felt like an eternity, the men left, muttering to each other about wasting time. Leora waited several minutes before slipping out of the room and back into the safety of the night. She had what she needed, but the near miss left her shaken. Over the next few days, her investigation deepened. She contacted an informant, someone who claimed to have inside knowledge of the precinct's operations. The meeting was set in a secluded bar on the outskirts of the city. The man, jittery and paranoid, leaned in close as he spoke. "They're moving people, you understand. It's all coordinated arrests, transfers, everything. Calloway's just a face. The real power is higher up." Leora listened intently, but something about his story didn't sit right. When she pressed for more details, his answers became evasive, contradictory, and then he slipped. "They're watching me," he whispered. "If I say too much, they'll know." "Who's they?" Leora asked. He froze, panic flashing across his face. Without another word, he bolted from the bar, leaving Leora with more questions than answers. The moment transits to Leora reviewing the files she had retrieved. The financial records pointed to something much larger than Calloway's precinct. Payments were being funneled through shell companies, tied to influential figures in the city. Calloway's role in the operation became less clear. Was he orchestrating these crimes, or was he merely a pawn in a much larger game? Leora couldn't shake the feeling that someone was using him as a shield, letting his reckless behavior draw attention while they stayed safely in the shadows. Was Officer Calloway just a cog in a much larger machine, or was he pulling the strings all along? Leora thought, the weight of the question lingering in her mind. Her next move had to be calculated. The evidence was mounting, but she needed something concrete, something that couldn't be dismissed or buried. The warehouse was her chance to find it, but it was also a trap waiting to spring. What was she walking into? And if Calloway wasn't the mastermind, who was? The night air was heavy with tension as Leora leaned against the rusted metal railing of an old bridge, waiting. The faint sound of rushing water below masked the distant hum of traffic from the city. This wasn't a place for casual meetings, but she wasn't here for pleasantries. Tonight, she was meeting a low-level gang member who had claimed to have critical information about the precinct's operations, a man desperate enough to betray his handlers but cautious enough to demand a secluded location. Leora saw him before he spotted her. Rico, a wiry man with darting eyes and a nervous tic, shuffled into view, glancing over his shoulder every few steps. He looked like a man who knew the consequences of betrayal and expected them at any moment. "Rico," Leora called out softly, her voice calm but firm. He jumped at the sound but quickly composed himself, nodding as he approached. "You got the cash?" "I have what you need," Leora replied, holding up a small envelope. "But you know the deal information first." Rico hesitated, his gaze darting around the area. Okay, they're using the precinct to move people, but it's not just Calloway. There's someone else higher up. The shipments go through the warehouse on 8th, but it's more than that. They're using fake arrests to cover the disappearances, then. His words trailed off as the sound of footsteps echoed from the shadows. Leora's instincts kicked in, her hand moving to the concealed weapon at her side. "You set me up, Rico?" she asked coldly, her eyes narrowing. I swear I didn't. Rico's protest was cut short as 3 men emerged from the darkness, their movements deliberate and menacing. "Rico, you talk too much," one of them growled, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. Before anyone could react, one of the men lunged at Rico, silencing him with a brutal punch that sent him crumpling to the ground. Leora moved instantly, her body a blur of precision and power. The first attacker swung a metal pipe at her, but she ducked, her movement fluid as she countered with a sharp elbow to his ribs. The impact forced him to stagger, leaving her enough time to deliver a spinning kick to his jaw, knocking him out cold. The second man charged at her, a knife gleaming in his hand. Leora sidestepped his attack, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The blade clattered to the ground, and she finished him with a quick knee strike to the face. The third man was more cautious, circling her as he pulled a pistol from his waistband. Leora didn't wait for him to aim. She leapt onto the railing, using her momentum to propel herself forward, her foot connecting with his wrist. The gun discharged, the shot echoing into the night, but the weapon flew from his grasp. A flurry of punches and blocks followed as Leora and the man exchanged blows, their movements fast and brutal. He managed to land a solid hit to her shoulder, but she used the momentum to spin into a low kick, sweeping his legs out from under him. Breathing heavily, Leora stood over the unconscious men, her senses still sharp. Rico was gone, and with him a crucial lead. She wiped a trace of blood from her lip, her mind racing. The ambush confirmed her fears someone was watching her every move. The moment transits to the abandoned warehouse on 8th Street, a massive structure looming in the dark. Floodlights illuminated the exterior, casting long shadows over the trucks parked near the loading bay. Leora had scouted the location earlier, noting the guards stationed at each entrance. She knew this wouldn't be easy. Dressed in dark tactical gear, she moved silently along the perimeter, her eyes scanning for a way inside. She spotted an open window on the 2nd floor and climbed the stack of crates beneath it, her agility turning the precarious ascent into a seamless maneuver. Once inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air was damp and filled with the faint smell of oil and rust. The sound of muffled voices and the occasional clang of metal echoed through the cavernous space. Leora crept along the metal walkways, her movements quiet as she observed the scene below. Men were loading crates into the backs of unmarked trucks, their actions methodical. She spotted Calloway in the center of the operation, barking orders. Nearby, a small office with glass windows glowed faintly, and she saw what she was looking for: a ledger sitting open on a desk. She made her way down, weaving between stacks of crates and ducking behind machinery. Reaching the office, she slipped inside and began flipping through the ledger. Names, dates, payment amounts, it was all there, the proof she needed. But as she pulled out her phone to take photos, a voice behind her made her freeze. Well, I was wondering when you'd show up," Calloway drawled, his tone mocking. Leora turned slowly to face him, her eyes scanning the room for an exit. Calloway stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 armed men. "You've been a thorn in my side for weeks," he said, stepping closer. "And now you're here, right where I want you." Leora smirked, her confidence unshaken. "You talk too much, Calloway." Before he could respond, she moved. In a blur, she flipped the desk onto its side, using it as cover as bullets tore through the air. She grabbed a metal pipe from the floor, using it to disarm one of the men who came at her. The fight was chaos. Leora darted between crates and machinery, her movements precise and calculated. She used the environment to her advantage, leaping onto platforms and swinging from beams to avoid gunfire. Calloway fired at her but missed, his frustration mounting. She managed to disarm the second man with a brutal kick to his knee, sending him sprawling. But Calloway was relentless, pursuing her through the maze of the warehouse. The chase ended on a high platform, where Leora found herself cornered. Calloway leveled his gun at her, his grin triumphant. "This is where it ends," he said, his finger tightening on the trigger. Leora's eyes flicked to a nearby lever, and without hesitation she pulled it. A crane swung into motion, its massive hook sweeping across the platform and knocking Calloway off balance. He dropped the gun as he fell, catching himself on the railing below. Leora stepped closer, looking down at him. "Not yet," she said, her voice cold. With Calloway subdued, Leora turned her attention back to the ledger. She had what she needed, but she knew this was only the beginning. Who was really pulling the strings, and how much further would she have to go to bring them down? The warehouse was a shadowy labyrinth, the dim glow of overhead lights casting uneven halos on the cracked concrete floor. The air was thick with the stench of oil and dampness, the silence punctuated by the occasional creak of old metal beams. Crates were stacked haphazardly throughout the space, each marked with strange, cryptic symbols, numbers, letters, and emblems that hinted at secrets better left buried. Leora stepped carefully, her every move deliberate as her boots barely made a sound against the cold floor. She held the ledger tightly, its weight both physical and symbolic. This was the key to unraveling everything, but it wasn't enough on its own. She needed more names, recordings, confessions, and for that, she would have to confront the monster himself, Bryce Calloway. She didn't have to wait long. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the cavernous space. Calloway emerged from the shadows, his face illuminated by the faint light. His uniform was crisp, a mockery of justice, and his smirk was laced with arrogance. "Well, if it isn't my favorite troublemaker," he drawled, his voice dripping with disdain. "Did you really think you could just waltz in here, take what you need, and leave?" Leora stood her ground, the ledger tucked under her arm. Her gaze was unflinching, her voice steady. "I didn't think it. I know it." Calloway chuckled, shaking his head. "You're bold, I'll give you that. But you're out of your league here, sweetheart. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Leora's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to his taunts. Instead, she took a step forward, her tone calm but cutting. "You think you're untouchable, Calloway. But I've been in this game long enough to know how men like you operate. You hide behind power and connections, thinking they'll protect you forever. They won't." For a moment, Calloway's expression flickered, the mask of confidence slipping just enough for Leora to catch a glimpse of the fear beneath. He quickly recovered, his smirk returning as he pulled a pistol from his holster, leveling it at her. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice cold. Leora didn't flinch. Instead, she took another step closer, her hands raised slightly, not in surrender, but in a gesture of calm. "I know more than you think. I know about your brother." The words hit like a thunderclap, the name that followed freezing Calloway in his tracks. "Marcus," she continued. "He was just a kid, wasn't he? 18, fresh out of the academy, eager to prove himself. And what happened? He was caught in the crossfire of a raid that shouldn't have even happened. An unjustified operation, ordered by the same corrupt machine you're working for now." Calloway's hand trembled, the barrel of the gun dipping slightly. "You don't get to talk about him," he growled, his voice tight with emotion. "I'm not your enemy, Bryce," Leora said, her tone softening. "But you've become part of the very thing that destroyed him. Do you think he'd be proud of what you're doing? Of the lives you've ruined?" For a fleeting moment, the warehouse seemed to hold its breath. Calloway's face twisted, a mixture of anger, guilt, and something else, something vulnerable. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the vulnerability hardened into rage. He raised the gun again, his knuckles white, as he aimed directly at her. "You don't know anything," he shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "You think you're better than me. You think you can come here and lecture me." Leora's heart pounded, but she stayed composed. "This isn't about me. It's about you. You still have a choice, Bryce. You can stop this. You can help me take them down, or you can go down with them." For a moment, the two stood in silence, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Leora could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between the man he used to be and the monster he had become. But before he could respond, a loud crash shattered the moment. The sound of reinforcements arriving brought them both back to reality. Calloway's men swarmed the warehouse, their weapons drawn, shouting orders. Leora knew she was outnumbered, but she also knew she couldn't leave without the ledger. Her mission depended on it. As the chaos erupted around her, Leora moved. She leapt onto a stack of crates, using her momentum to propel herself onto a higher platform. Gunfire rang out, bullets sparking against metal as she ducked and weaved, her agility keeping her one step ahead. Calloway shouted orders, his voice rising above the commotion. "Don't let her escape. Take her alive." Leora used the environment to her advantage, swinging from overhead beams and sliding down rails. She disarmed one attacker with a swift kick, sending his rifle clattering to the floor. Another lunged at her with a knife, but she sidestepped, using his momentum to throw him into a stack of crates. Despite her skill, the odds were against her. The men kept coming, and every movement drained her energy. She had to think fast. Spotting a chain hanging from a crane, she grabbed it, using it to swing across the warehouse and land near the exit. She turned back briefly, her eyes meeting Calloway's. "This isn't over," she said, her voice firm. And with that, she disappeared into the night, the ledger clutched tightly in her hand. The question now wasn't just whether she could take down Calloway and his operation, but how far she would have to go to do it, and whether Calloway's hesitation in pulling the trigger would become her greatest advantage or her deadliest mistake. The night was far from quiet as Leora darted through the labyrinthine warehouse, her breath sharp and controlled. The echoes of shouted orders and the clatter of boots chasing her reverberated in the massive space. Every move she made was calculated, a blend of instinct and training. She knew the terrain better than they did. She had studied it during her earlier reconnaissance, committing every corner, every shadow to memory. Calloway's voice barked through the chaos, his frustration mounting. "Fan out. She's not getting out of here alive with that ledger." Leora gripped the ledger tightly against her chest as she maneuvered through the rows of crates. Her eyes darted to the rafters above, where she spotted a dangling chain she had used earlier in her escape. It was still swinging faintly from when she had swung across it. The sight stirred her memory, her earlier sparring session with a trainee where she had demonstrated a spinning kick to disarm an opponent. That technique had seemed routine then, but now she realized it might be her only chance to even the odds. Her pursuers were closing in. She could hear their footsteps growing louder, their shadows stretching closer in the dim light. Leora spun into action. She leapt onto a nearby stack of crates and waited until the first man approached. He spotted her and lunged forward, raising his weapon to strike. In one fluid motion, she executed the spinning kick, her foot connecting with his wrist, sending the gun clattering to the floor. The maneuver left him stunned. She followed it with a swift punch to his jaw, knocking him unconscious before disappearing into the shadows once more. The men chasing her hesitated now, their movements cautious. They had underestimated her, and it was a mistake she was exploiting. As she navigated deeper into the warehouse, Leora's sharp eyes caught something she had noticed earlier in the night: exposed wiring snaking along the walls near a junction box. The insulation was frayed, the wires sparking faintly with each vibration of the warehouse floor. It was a hazard she had mentally logged earlier, but now it was a potential weapon. The moment Calloway rounded the corner, his gun trained on her, Leora shifted her stance, keeping the wiring in her peripheral vision. "Give it up, Moro," Calloway sneered, his confidence as loud as his words. "You've been a nuisance for too long. But this is where it ends." Leora tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You really think so? You've already lost, Calloway. You just don't know it yet." Calloway's smirk faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly. Big words for someone cornered. "Now, drop the ledger, or I'll—" His threat was interrupted by a sudden spark from the wiring behind him. The vibration of the men chasing Leora had disturbed the junction box, and the exposed wires hissed and crackled, sending a bright arc of electricity to a nearby stack of crates. Leora's eyes widened as flames licked the edge of the crates, the fire catching rapidly as it fed on the dry wood and packing material. Smoke began to rise, the air filling with the acrid stench of burning. Calloway turned, his momentary distraction giving Leora the opening she needed. With precise timing, she darted forward, sweeping his legs out from under him. Calloway hit the ground hard, his gun skidding across the floor. Before he could recover, Leora retrieved the weapon and aimed it at him. The fire spread quickly, the heat intensifying as flames leapt from crate to crate. Leora's mind raced. She couldn't leave Calloway here, not like this. Not even he deserved to burn alive. She grabbed him by the collar, dragging him toward the nearest exit. "You're lucky I'm not like you," she muttered through gritted teeth as she hauled him to his feet. Calloway stumbled, coughing as the smoke thickened, but Leora kept moving, her focus unwavering. The fire raged around them, creating an inferno that illuminated the warehouse in a hellish glow. The faulty wiring, once a silent danger, had turned into a catastrophic blaze. Leora reached the exit just as the flames consumed the area they had been moments before. She shoved Calloway outside, collapsing to her knees as she gulped in fresh air. Calloway coughed violently, his bravado burned away along with the warehouse. He looked at Leora, a mixture of anger and disbelief in his eyes. "Why didn't you just let me die in there?" Leora stood slowly, brushing ash from her jacket. Her voice was calm, almost detached. "Because taking you down the right way will be so much more satisfying." As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, Leora knew this was only the beginning. The ledger in her hand was proof of Calloway's crimes, but it wasn't enough to bring down the entire operation. There were still bigger players pulling the strings, and she wouldn't stop until every last one of them was exposed. Who was really behind the trafficking ring? And how far would Leora have to go to bring them to justice? Leora stood outside the burning warehouse, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, and the red and blue glow of approaching police vehicles lit up the night. She glanced down at the charred ledger still clutched in her hands, its pages partially singed but intact. It was the culmination of weeks of work, a damning record of the corruption that had infested the precinct. Bryce Calloway leaned against a nearby wall, coughing violently as he tried to regain his composure. His arrogance was gone, replaced by the raw, stripped-down reality of defeat. He stared at Leora, his expression unreadable, but she could see the storm brewing behind his eyes, a mix of anger, fear, and something close to grudging respect. The first police car skidded to a halt nearby, its tires screeching against the pavement. Officers poured out, their weapons drawn, their faces hard with determination. Leora stepped back, raising her hands to show she wasn't a threat. She expected them to rush toward her, to take Calloway into custody, but instead they froze. From the second car, a man in a crisp suit emerged, his presence commanding immediate attention. Deputy Chief Michael Hargrave, a name Leora recognized all too well. Hargrave had a spotless public record, but in her investigation she had seen enough to suspect he was far from clean. His sharp gaze swept over the scene before landing on Calloway. "Get him in the car," Hargrave ordered, his tone curt. Leora's brow furrowed. "He's your suspect," she said, her voice cutting through the tense air. "You've got evidence now, everything you need to take him down." Hargrave ignored her, signaling two officers to help Calloway to his feet. They moved without hesitation, their loyalty to Hargrave clear. Calloway smirked faintly as they escorted him toward the second car, his confidence rekindled. Leora stepped forward. "He's running a trafficking ring under your noses, or maybe with your help. If you let him go, you're complicit." Hargrave turned to face her, his expression cold and impenetrable. "Watch your tone, Agent Morrow. You're far from home here." Leora didn't back down. "I have evidence. Enough to blow this entire operation wide open." "And yet," Hargrave said, stepping closer, "you're still standing in my jurisdiction, without a warrant, operating on classified information that I'm fairly certain you didn't obtain through legal channels. So I suggest you hand over whatever you think you have, and we'll decide how to proceed." Her grip tightened on the ledger, her instincts screaming at her to run, to disappear before they turned their sights on her. But she couldn't leave without knowing the full scope of what she was up against. "You're protecting him," she said, her voice low but resolute. "And I'm going to find out why." Hargrave's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "You're welcome to try. But you'll find it's not just Calloway you're up against. Some things are bigger than you, Agent." Leora didn't respond. She turned and walked away, her heart pounding as she slipped into the shadows, the ledger still in her possession. The sounds of Calloway being loaded into the car behind her only fueled her resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The moment transits to the quiet stillness of Leora's FBI office. The glow of her computer screen lit up her determined face as she uploaded the contents of the ledger to a secure server. The files transferred one by one, each piece of data another nail in the coffin for Calloway and whoever was protecting him. As the final file uploaded, her monitor flickered. The transfer halted and a new screen appeared, black with a single line of text that sent a chill down her spine. "Stay out of this, or you're next." Her hand hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing. Someone knew what she was doing, someone with enough access to intercept a secure FBI upload. She glanced around the office, suddenly hyper-aware of how exposed she was. Then her phone buzzed. She picked it up, and the message on the screen was even more unsettling. "This is your only warning. Walk away, or you won't get another chance." Leora's jaw clenched as she deleted the message, her heart pounding. She wasn't one to scare easily, but this was a different kind of threat. Whoever she was up against had resources, connections, and the willingness to make her disappear. She stared at the screen, the ominous warning still pulsing in her mind. Who was behind the message? How deep did the corruption go? And how much time did she have before they made good on their threat? Leora leaned back in her chair, her resolve hardening. They wanted her to walk away, but they underestimated her. She wasn't just chasing justice, she was chasing revenge for every life Calloway and his cronies had ruined. She muttered to herself, her voice barely a whisper, "You're going to regret this." The screen went dark, but Leora's determination burned brighter than ever. The dim glow of her computer screen faded into darkness, but the weight of the message lingered in the air like a ghost. Leora leaned back in her chair, her mind racing through possibilities. The ledger was damning names, dates, payments all tied together in a web of deceit and corruption. But now she knew she was playing a game far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. The message on her computer was proof that the enemy wasn't just watching, they were ready to act. She opened her phone, scrolling through the photos she'd taken of the ledger before the message interrupted her upload. Her fingers paused on one name. Deputy Chief Michael Hargrave. He wasn't just protecting Calloway, he was a central piece in the operation. His fingerprints were all over the financial transactions, connecting the precinct to a string of disappearances. Her gaze hardened. She had to act fast. Every moment she delayed gave them more time to cover their tracks, to destroy evidence, and to eliminate loose ends, including her. The next morning, Leora returned to the burned-out warehouse under the guise of a city safety inspector. The smell of ash and charred wood still hung heavy in the air as she walked through the wreckage, her eyes scanning for anything the fire hadn't destroyed. Most of the crates had been reduced to blackened debris, but in a corner untouched by the blaze she found a metal lockbox. It was heavy, the lock rusted but intact. She pried it open with a crowbar, revealing sealed envelopes stuffed with cash, falsified documents, and what appeared to be shipping manifests. She slipped the contents into her bag, her mind piecing together the fragments of the operation. Each manifest listed items labeled as cargo, but the accompanying weight measurements didn't add up too heavy for ordinary goods. The dates aligned perfectly with the missing persons reports. This was the smoking gun she needed. Back at her temporary base, Leora laid out the evidence. Names and dates stared back at her like a puzzle waiting to be solved. She pinned the shipping manifest to a corkboard, drawing lines between locations, dates, and payments. Her phone buzzed. It was a secure message from her contact within the FBI, Agent Marcos Delgado. Saw the message on your upload attempt. Be careful. Hargrave's reach is wider than we thought. They've got insiders everywhere. Meet me at the safe house at midnight. Leora's grip on the phone tightened. Delgado was one of the few people she trusted. If he was warning her, the situation was even more precarious than she realized. Midnight came quickly, and Leora arrived at the safe house, a nondescript apartment on the outskirts of Ravenhurst. Delgado greeted her at the door, his face etched with concern. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I didn't have a choice," Leora replied, spreading out the evidence she'd gathered. "This isn't just about Calloway. Hargrave's running the entire operation, and he's got people everywhere, judges, politicians, even within the Bureau." Delgado scanned the documents, his expression darkening. "This is enough to take them down. But it won't be easy. They're going to come after you harder now. They'll try to discredit you, make you disappear if they have to." "Let them try," Leora said, her voice steely. "I'm not backing down." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden crash outside. Delgado froze, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. Leora signaled for silence, her pulse quickening. The safe house wasn't so safe anymore. The next moments unfolded in chaos. A team of masked operatives burst through the door, their movements swift and calculated. Delgado fired a warning shot, taking down one of the intruders, but they were outnumbered. Leora moved like a force of nature, her training taking over as she disarmed one attacker and used his weapon against another. Delgado covered her, but a bullet grazed his arm, forcing him to retreat behind a table. Leora grabbed a flash grenade from Delgado's gear, pulling the pin and tossing it into the center of the room. The explosion of light and sound disoriented their attackers, giving Leora and Delgado just enough time to escape through a back window. As they ran into the night, Delgado clutched his injured arm, his breaths labored. "They knew we'd be here," he said. "There's no safe place anymore." "There's one," Leora replied, determination burning in her eyes. "But we'll have to move fast." The moment transits to the FBI headquarters, where Leora uploads the remaining evidence from a secure server. As the files transfer, she types a report detailing everything she's uncovered, naming Hargrave and Calloway as key players in the operation. The upload completes, and she leans back, exhausted but resolute. Just as she's about to log off, the screen flickers. A new message appears, stark against the black background. "You think this is over? It's not. You've only scratched the surface." A chill runs down her spine as the message vanishes, replaced by another. "This is just the beginning." The room was silent except for the faint hum of Leora's computer. Her eyes were locked on the message that had flashed across the screen moments earlier. "This is just the beginning." She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the warning sinking in. This wasn't just about Calloway or Hargrave anymore. This was a network, sprawling and intricate, and someone was watching her every move. What would you do if you were in Leora's position? Would you keep going or walk away? The moment transitions to Leora driving through the dark streets of Ravenhurst, her jaw set, her mind racing. The weight of her mission pressed on her shoulders, but she knew the stakes were bigger than her own safety. The ledger and the evidence she had gathered were enough to cripple the operation, but only if she could get it into the right hands. Her car's radio buzzed with static before a voice cut through. It was her FBI contact, Marcos Delgado. "Leora, we've got a problem. Hargrave's people are on the move. They're clearing out key locations, scrubbing evidence. If you're holding on to anything, they'll come for you." "I'm already on their radar," she said, gripping the wheel tighter. "Where are you?" Delgado's voice was grim. "I'm tracking a convoy leaving the docks. They've got something big, but I can't confirm what. I'll send the location." The convoy was a trail of black SUVs winding through the industrial outskirts of the city. Leora parked her car a safe distance away, watching as the vehicles pulled into a massive warehouse surrounded by armed guards. Suspenseful music swelled as she scanned the perimeter, formulating a plan. The camera focused on her face, her determination unwavering. This was her only chance to uncover the full extent of the operation. She slipped into the shadows, her every step calculated, her breathing steady. Inside the warehouse, the atmosphere was tense. Men moved crates stamped with cryptic symbols, the same markings she had seen in the burned-out warehouse. Hargrave was there, his commanding presence unmistakable. He barked orders, his voice carrying over the sound of forklifts and machinery. Leora moved along the catwalks above, her eyes scanning the scene below. She spotted a locked room in the corner, heavily guarded. Whatever was inside, it was important enough to warrant this level of security. She knew she had to get to it. The music shifted to a faster tempo as Leora descended silently, taking out a guard with a quick, precise strike. She dragged him into the shadows before moving toward the locked room. Picking the lock, she slipped inside, her flashlight illuminating rows of binders, hard drives, and documents. Her heart raced as she flipped through the files, shipping manifests, financial records, and surveillance photos all tied to Hargrave's operation. But one file stopped her cold. It contained photos of her, detailed accounts of her movements, and a copy of her FBI credentials. They had been tracking her. Before she could process the implications, the door burst open. Hargrave stood there, flanked by armed men. His face was a mask of fury and triumph. "Well, Agent Moreau," he said, his voice laced with venom, "you've been busy." The focus is on Leora, bound to a chair in a dimly lit room. She was busted suddenly. Hargrave stood in front of her, his hands clasped behind his back. "You think you're a hero," he said, pacing slowly. "But you're just another cog in a broken system. You don't know who you're up against." Leora's voice was steady, even defiant. "You think you can scare me? You're running out of places to hide, Hargrave." Hargrave smirked. "I'm not the one hiding, Agent. You're out of your depth." As he turned to leave, Leora's mind raced. She had seen a glimmer of hope, a guard's poorly concealed weapon holstered near her. She knew what she had to do. The escape was chaos. Leora disarmed the guard with a swift move, using the weapon to fight her way out. The battle was brutal, every punch and shot a desperate bid for survival. She moved with precision, using the environment to her advantage, ducking behind crates, climbing onto platforms, and improvising weapons from anything within reach. Hargrave escaped in the commotion, leaving Leora alone with the evidence she had gathered. She knew she had bought herself time, but not much. The operation wasn't over, and the man pulling the strings was still out there. Back at her FBI office, Leora uploaded the files she had recovered to a secure server. As the data streamed in, her screen flickered, and a familiar message appeared. "This isn't over. Walk away, or we'll end this for you." Leora stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. She reached for her phone, dialing a secure number. When the line connected, she spoke with quiet determination. "We're going to need more than this. It's time to take the fight to them." The screen lingers on Leora's weary face as she sits in the dim glow of her office, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Every piece of evidence she's collected flashes across her mind: the ledger, the shipping manifests, the surveillance photos of her own movements. Her enemies were far more powerful than she had anticipated, with resources that reached deeper than anyone could imagine. She was in their crosshairs now, but this wasn't just about her survival, it was about exposing the truth, no matter the cost. She took a deep breath and pressed enter, uploading the files to a secure server. The progress bar crept forward, every second dragging like an eternity. The tension in the room was palpable. What would you do if you were in Leora's position? Would you risk everything to expose the truth? Put your thought in the comment section before we continue the story. Back to the story, the screen flickered as the upload completed. A wave of relief washed over Leora, but it was short-lived. A new message popped up, stark against the black screen. "We warned you, Agent Moreau. Walk away, or there will be consequences." Leora leaned back, her expression unreadable. Her phone buzzed on the desk, the caller ID showing unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. A distorted voice greeted her, calm yet threatening. "You've gone too far, Agent. Turn yourself in and hand over the evidence, or your career won't be the only thing destroyed." Leora's grip on the phone tightened. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady. "You should be afraid of me." The line went dead, leaving her alone with the weight of her decision. She stared at the screen, the message still glowing ominously, as she silently vowed to push forward. The moment transits to a bustling newsroom. A reporter holds up a folder, addressing the camera with urgency. "Shocking revelations tonight from a whistleblower within Ravenhurst City's police force. The documents leaked to our station implicate high-ranking officials in a sprawling human trafficking operation. The key players? None other than Deputy Chief Michael Hargrave and Officer Bryce Calloway. Federal agents have confirmed an ongoing investigation, but no arrests have been made yet." The moment shifts to footage of protests outside the precinct, citizens demanding justice. Tension builds as the music swells, the camera focusing on Hargrave exiting a black SUV, flanked by bodyguards. His expression is calm, calculated, but his eyes betray a flicker of unease. As Hargrave steps into the precinct, an officer rushes up to him, whispering something into his ear. His face darkens and he turns abruptly, barking orders to his men. The screen cuts to Leora watching the scene unfold on her computer. A message flashes on her screen. "They're moving assets. You need to act now." Leora gears up, her movements deliberate and efficient. The music picks up tempo as she straps on a tactical vest and holsters a weapon. Her expression is grim but determined. She knows this is her last chance to get ahead of Hargrave and Calloway before they erase every trace of their operation. The moment transitions to the outskirts of the city, where a convoy of black SUVs barrels down a deserted road toward a private airstrip. Leora follows at a distance, her car blending into the shadows. She watches as the vehicles pull up to a waiting plane, crates being loaded onto the aircraft by armed men. She radios Delgado, who's coordinating backup. "I've got eyes on them. They're trying to flee. I need units at the airstrip now." Delgado's voice crackles back. "We're on our way. Don't engage until we get there." But Leora knows she doesn't have time to wait. The music crescendos as she exits her car, moving swiftly and silently toward the airstrip. She takes out 2 guards with precise, calculated strikes, their bodies crumpling silently to the ground. Inside the plane, Hargrave oversees the final preparations, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "This is it," he says to Calloway. "Once we're airborne, they won't be able to touch us." Calloway nods, but his confidence is shattered when a commotion erupts outside. Shots ring out, and one of Hargrave's men rushes in. "It's her," he shouts. "She's here." Hargrave's face tightens as he grabs a gun and steps out of the plane, scanning the darkness for Leora. The camera lingers on his expression as the music shifts to a sharp, tense rhythm. Leora moves through the chaos, her movements fluid and relentless. She uses the environment to her advantage, climbing onto crates and leaping across platforms to avoid gunfire. When Calloway appears in her path, she confronts him directly. "End of the line, Bryce," she says, her voice cutting through the chaos. Calloway hesitates, his gun wavering. "You don't know what you're dealing with, Leora. They'll bury you for this." "Maybe," she replies, lunging forward. In a blur of motion, she disarms him with the same spinning kick she demonstrated earlier, sending his weapon clattering to the ground. The fight is intense, every move deliberate as they exchange blows. Calloway is strong, but Leora's precision and training give her the upper hand. She lands a final strike, leaving him unconscious as Delgado's team arrives. Hargrave escapes into the chaos, disappearing into the night. Delgado approaches Leora as the remaining guards are arrested. "We've got the evidence," Delgado says, holding up a secured hard drive. Leora nods, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not enough. Hargrave's still out there." Delgado places a hand on her shoulder. "We'll get him. This is just the beginning." The night was alive with chaos at the airstrip. Leora moved through the shadows, her steps calculated as she closed in on the villain's final stronghold. The crates being loaded onto the private jet bore the same cryptic markings she'd seen before, each one a symbol of the human lives exploited by Hargrave's operation. Delgado's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Units are surrounding the airstrip. We're not letting anyone leave this time." Leora crouched behind a stack of crates, her eyes fixed on the plane. Hargrave stood at the top of the stairs leading into the aircraft, his expression a mix of defiance and desperation. Calloway was beside him, pacing nervously, his bravado stripped away. "Stay sharp," Leora whispered into her mic. "They're armed, and they'll fight to the end." As Delgado's team moved into position, the tension mounted. Suspenseful music swelled as Hargrave barked orders to his men, gesturing wildly toward the perimeter. "Keep them back. Get this plane in the air now." But it was too late. Leora sprang into action, leading a coordinated assault. Her movements were swift and precise, taking down guards with a mix of martial arts and tactical strikes. Delgado's team backed her up, surrounding the plane and cutting off escape routes. Hargrave, realizing he was cornered, turned to Calloway. "We can still get out of this. Grab the files and follow me." But Calloway hesitated, his confidence shattered. "It's over, Hargrave. Look around, you've lost." Hargrave snarled, grabbing Calloway by the collar. "Don't you dare fold on me now. We've come too far." Leora emerged from the shadows, her weapon trained on them. "Drop it, Hargrave. It's over." Hargrave turned to face her, his gun raised. "You think you've won. You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Leora said, her voice steady. "You're just another corrupt coward who thought he was untouchable." The standoff was tense, but Hargrave wasn't willing to surrender. He fired, forcing Leora to dive behind cover. The gunfire drew Delgado and his team closer, surrounding the plane completely. Hargrave's men began dropping their weapons one by one, realizing the fight was futile. Calloway, overwhelmed by the inevitability of their defeat, dropped to his knees. "I'm done," he muttered, raising his hands in surrender. Leora stepped out, her weapon still trained on Hargrave. "It's over. Don't make this any worse." Hargrave hesitated, his eyes darting between Leora and the advancing agents. Finally, he threw his gun to the ground, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The moment transitioned to the next day. Hargrave and Calloway sat in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents, as they were paraded in front of reporters at a press conference. The evidence Leora had collected, the ledger, the manifests, the financial records, was presented to the public, leaving no room for doubt. The newscaster's voice narrated the scene. In a historic takedown, Deputy Chief Michael Hargrave and Officer Bryce Calloway, along with several accomplices, have been arrested on charges ranging from human trafficking to corruption and obstruction of justice. Federal investigators confirm that this operation has dismantled a major criminal network. Leora stood in the background, watching as justice unfolded. Delgado approached her, a rare smile breaking through his usually serious demeanor. "You did it," he said. "This is the kind of win we don't see often." "It's not just a win," Leora replied, her tone resolute. "It's a message. No one is above the law." In the final moments, Leora sat in her office, reviewing the case files one last time. The names of the victims, the lives that had been destroyed, weighed heavily on her. She knew this wasn't the end of corruption, but it was a start. Her phone buzzed with a message from Delgado. "Drinks are on me tonight. You deserve it." Leora smirked, setting the phone down. She looked out the window, the city sprawling before her. Justice had been served, but her work was far from over. Would you have done the same in Leora's position? How far would you go to bring someone like Hargrave to justice? Put your thoughts in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe for the next action-packed stories.